Frank Thompson stood trembling at the Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport security checkpoint, feeling all eyes on him. In his hands, he clutched his worn leather carry-on, and on his back he wore the decades-old Army dress uniform that he hadn't donned in years. Its once bright brass buttons were now tarnished and rusty, the fabric faded to a dull hue. As he shuffled forward, the TSA scanner alarm blared. People in line groaned as he was asked to step aside for a pat-down. A few impatient travelers exchanged amused smirks. To them, Frank looked like an old relic holding up the line. "Seriously, who wears that to an airport?" a young man muttered just loud enough for Frank to hear. A couple of others chuckled under their breaths. Frank's cheeks burned with embarrassment. He tried to straighten his stooped shoulders, attempting a bit of dignity as a blue-gloved TSA agent carefully examined his uniform's metal buttons and pinned medals. Each second felt like an eternity to Frank. Decades ago, he'd been a battlefield medic in World War II, running through gunfire to save fallen comrades. Now, at 90 years old, he was being mocked for those very service medals and insignia. Just as the humiliation peaked, a sudden hush fell over the bustling terminal. From behind the security line, 5 tall figures emerged, cutting through the crowd with quiet authority. They were clad in immaculate military uniforms, the insignia of 4-star generals gleaming on their shoulders. In an instant, these men snapped to rigid attention around Frank. The TSA agent froze mid-pat-down, and the jeering laughter died immediately. Travelers and airport staff stared in confusion and awe at the unexpected sight. Frank's heart pounded. He had no idea what was happening or who these imposing figures were. It all unfolded in seconds. One moment, Frank was a target of ridicule, and the next, America's highest-ranking generals were surrounding him like an honor guard. And what they did next would stun everyone present, and soon, an entire nation. If you believe heroes like Frank deserve our utmost respect, stand with us by subscribing for more uplifting stories. That morning, Frank had carefully laid out his uniform on his bed. The deep blue jacket and matching trousers had survived mothballs and time, just like he had survived the war. With trembling fingers, he had polished the medals on the chest, a bronze star and a purple heart among them, though some of the older brass buttons were too rusted to shine. He almost left the uniform in the closet, worried it might seem out of place in the modern world. But today, he felt an urge to wear it. It was his way of honoring the buddies he'd lost and the country he served. As a World War II field medic, Frank had saved dozens of lives, yet he never considered himself a hero. Now, in his 90s, he moved a bit slower, and his back was bent with age, but his pride in his service remained as strong as ever. Outside, the Texas sun had just risen as Frank arrived at DFW Airport. He stepped out of the taxi, adjusting his cap carefully over his thin white hair. A few people turned their heads at the sight of an elderly man in full uniform stepping onto the curb. One airline employee at the curbside check-in gave Frank a small, respectful nod and opened the door for him. Frank offered a polite smile in return, clutching the handle of his suitcase with one hand and a wooden cane in the other. He had insisted on walking on his own, refusing a wheelchair service. This trip was important to him. He was flying to a military reunion that weekend, a chance to meet the last few comrades from his old unit while he still could. Inside the terminal, Frank navigated through the crowds of hurried travelers. Electronic departure boards blinked overhead, and the air was filled with the chatter of announcements and rolling suitcases. He couldn't help but notice the curious glances. Most were benign or friendly. A little girl waved at him shyly, and Frank chuckled, giving a tiny wave back. But many people were too absorbed in their phones or rushed to pay attention. To them, he was just another passenger. Frank didn't mind that. He never wore his uniform for attention. In fact, he felt a flutter of nervousness in his stomach. Part of him wondered if it had been a mistake to dress this way today. Would people think he was showing off? He swallowed his doubt and kept walking. After checking in and getting his boarding pass, Frank headed toward the security area. The line at the TSA checkpoint snaked long, dozens of travelers unloading laptops and shoes into plastic bins. Frank dutifully removed his own scuffed dress shoes and placed his cane and carry-on on the conveyor belt. He took a deep breath as he stepped forward, his heart pounding not from exertion but anticipation. This was the moment he always dreaded on his rare flights, the scrutiny, the curious eyes. Just stay calm, stay respectful, he reminded himself. As he inched closer to the metal detector, he straightened his jacket and stood as tall as his 5 feet 6 inches frame would allow. He had no idea that beyond that checkpoint, a test of his dignity and a remarkable surprise was waiting for him. Have you ever witnessed a veteran being mistreated or honored in public? What would you do in that situation? Frank placed his arms out to his sides as the TSA officer gently patted him down. The metal detector had indeed flagged his uniform's buttons and medals, and now the young agent was methodically checking each one. Frank noticed the line of travelers behind him growing restless. He felt a knot tightening in his stomach. His worst fear was coming true. He was causing a delay. Behind him, a businessman in a crisp suit exhaled dramatically. "Come on, I'm going to miss my flight," the man groaned. Another person muttered, "This is ridiculous," loud enough for others to hear. Frank's ears burned. He tried to turn his head to offer an apologetic glance, but the TSA agent firmly instructed him to stay still. It was mortifying. The old medic stood there in stocking feet, arms out, while dozens of strangers looked on. As the pat-down continued, a teenage girl in line giggled to her friend, pointing at one of Frank's faded shoulder patches. Frank caught the words "old costume" and his face fell. A middle-aged man snickered. "This isn't a war reenactment, buddy. Why wear that here?" The remark stung. Frank lowered his eyes to the floor, wishing he could disappear. He had endured enemy fire and saved men under real bullets, but enduring the scorn of his own countrymen was a new kind of pain. Finally, the TSA officer finished. "You're all set, sir. Thank you for your patience," he said quietly, perhaps sensing Frank's discomfort. Frank managed a faint smile and stepped forward to gather his belongings. His hands shook slightly as he put his shoes back on. In his haste, he dropped his boarding pass and bent down slowly to pick it up. The businessman behind him clicked his tongue in irritation. "Unbelievable," the man muttered. A couple of others just stared, either indifferent or embarrassed for him. Heart pounding, Frank straightened up and fumbled to put on his uniform jacket again. He could feel hot tears of humiliation pricking at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them back. Maybe I shouldn't have worn the uniform, he thought, chest heavy with regret. In that moment, he felt utterly alone. "Excuse me, sir," came a deep voice from just beyond the checkpoint. Frank looked up, startled. Stepping out of the crowd was an older man in a dark green Army service uniform, laden with medals and a name tag that Frank couldn't quite read. On the man's shoulders gleamed 4 silver stars. Frank's breath caught in his throat. 4 stars meant a general, one of the highest ranks in the military. And not just one. As Frank's vision focused, he realized 5 such men had appeared, like a formation of eagles descending. They were a striking sight amid the sea of t-shirts and business suits. Some wore Army green, one was in the Navy's crisp whites, another in Air Force blue. Each bore the emblem of a 4-star officer. The businessman who had been complaining fell silent, his eyes wide. A hush rippled through the nearby crowd as more people noticed the towering officers. These generals were clearly not ordinary travelers. They exuded authority and dignity. The lead general, a tall man in his late 60s with steely gray hair, approached Frank first. The ribbons on the general's chest told a story of decades of service, and his gaze was intense yet compassionate. "Is everything all right here?" the general asked quietly, but there was no mistaking the edge in his voice. The TSA agent immediately stood straighter. "Yes, General. Everything's fine. We've concluded the screening." Frank, unsure what to do, nodded in agreement. "I'm fine, sir." His voice wavered with emotion and confusion. The general's stern expression softened as he looked at Frank's face, then at the faded medals and insignia on Frank's uniform. "1st Infantry Division, Medic, World War II. Is that right?" he said, reading the old patch on Frank's shoulder. Frank blinked in astonishment and managed to answer. Yes, sir. I was a field medic, 1st Infantry, in Europe, a long time ago." His voice was barely above a whisper. For a moment, the lead general's eyes glistened, as if picturing the young soldier Frank once was. "My father fought in Europe as well," the general said warmly, loud enough for those around to hear. "Men like you saved his life after he was wounded in battle." The general then drew himself to attention and added, "I never got to thank the medic who helped him. So, allow me to thank you, on his behalf and on behalf of our country." Frank's eyes widened. He opened his mouth to respond, but words failed him. Before he could utter a sound, the lead general gave a brisk nod to the other 4 officers. In perfect unison, the 5 generals snapped to attention. Their boots clicked together, and their right hands rose sharply to their brows in a synchronized salute. They formed 2 straight lines on either side of Frank, creating a human tunnel of honor. Time seemed to freeze. Frank stood at the mouth of this tunnel, stunned and motionless, as 5 of the nation's highest-ranking military leaders held their salute to him, a humble medic, without a single hesitation. If moments like this restore your faith in humanity, please subscribe for more inspiring stories. For a heartbeat, Frank simply stood there, quivering, not fully believing this was real. Then, remembering his military training from so long ago, he managed to raise his right hand shakily to return the salute. The moment his fingertips touched his brow, a tear rolled down his cheek. He was saluting back, eye to eye with 5 generals. The officers held their salute a moment longer, then lowered their arms. The lead general stepped forward and firmly shook Frank's hand. "Thank you for your service, medic," he said, his voice resonating through the silent checkpoint. The other generals gathered around, each taking a turn to shake Frank's hand or clap him gently on the shoulder. Frank's eyes brimmed with tears. I don't deserve this. I was just doing my duty," he whispered humbly. "You've more than earned this honor," the chairman of the Joint Chiefs replied, squeezing Frank's hand. Only now did Frank notice the name tag. This was the highest-ranking military officer in the nation, and alongside him were the chiefs of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. These men had interrupted their own travel just to acknowledge him. Frank's throat tightened with gratitude. Around them, the terminal was utterly still for a moment, then erupted into applause. A wave of clapping and cheering swept through the crowd of bystanders who had gathered. Travelers in other lines paused to see what was happening. Some wiped tears from their eyes at the touching scene. "God bless you, sir," shouted someone from the back. "Thank you for your service," a woman called out. The businessman who had complained earlier now stood red-faced and ashamed. He slowly stepped forward and offered his hand to Frank. "Sir, I'm so sorry for what I said. And thank you," the man murmured, looking genuinely remorseful. Frank, ever gracious, simply nodded and shook the man's trembling hand. The teenager who had giggled was recording with her phone now, her face solemn with new understanding. The same little girl who had waved at Frank before ran up to him with her father in tow. She gave Frank a shy hug around his legs. Frank patted the child's back softly, smiling through his tears. In that instant, generations were bridged by simple gratitude. One of the generals put an arm around Frank's shoulders and turned to the crowd. "Let's get this hero to his gate," he announced. As they escorted Frank through the terminal, people parted to make way, many still clapping. Strangers came up to shake Frank's hand as he passed. It seemed as if no one in that area wanted to let this moment end. Phones were pointed at the scene from every direction. Unbeknownst to Frank, dozens of videos of the airport salute tunnel were already making their way to social media. By the time Frank reached his gate, the story was spreading across the internet. The next day, he would wake up to find himself on the front page of news sites and trending on every platform, hailed as a national hero. The humiliating footage of him being mocked was now overshadowed by the uplifting image of 5 generals saluting him. As Frank finally boarded his flight, with a little extra help from the airline staff who upgraded his seat in honor, he felt a profound sense of peace. Where he had earlier felt small and ridiculed, now he felt seen and valued. Other passengers on the plane smiled at him warmly, and a young man even offered to stow Frank's bag. Word of what happened had spread quickly, and respect followed Frank wherever he went in that airport. In the days that followed, millions of people watched the videos of Frank's journey through that living tunnel of salutes. Comments and letters poured in thanking him for his service. Frank's quiet act of wearing his uniform had ignited a nationwide conversation about honoring veterans. The 5 generals issued a humble statement that they only did what was right, and that Frank represents a generation that paved the way for all who came after. Frank's story is proof that true respect costs nothing, yet its ripple effect can restore dignity, bridge generations, and remind us of the quiet heroes living among us. One moment of honor turned a cruel situation into an unforgettable lesson in kindness. And for Frank, what began as one of his worst days had become one of the greatest honors of his life. With his faith in people rekindled, the 90-something-year-old veteran stepped off that plane at his destination, walking a little taller than before. He knew that the gratitude shown to him wasn't just for him alone, but for every serviceman and woman who sacrificed quietly without recognition. Thus, in a bustling airport on an ordinary day, a remarkable act of respect blossomed. A nation was reminded that sometimes the smallest gestures, like a salute or a simple thank you, can mean the world to someone who gave us their all. And Frank, the humble medic who once thought he'd been forgotten, learned that no hero is ever truly forgotten when just one person decides to stand up and say, "Thank you."